Welcome to our study, Women Speak of God. We often think of the past as truly past, as something finished, as something done, and often as something irrelevant. Especially in our own day and time, we think of our own time as somehow new and improved, that things from the past are inferior, that our own time is surely smarter, wiser, more technologically advanced, that we must somehow be superior simply by living later in history. This is called the progressive view of history, so things progress and get better and better. So it's sort of hard to think about why should we bother listening to ancient voices and listening to people from the past. Our way of thinking about the past is very different from the ancient way of thinking. In the ancient world, older is better. Things new are suspect. Innovations are not to be trusted. But we are convinced that new and improved tide is really new and improved. That newer is an improvement and is better. In the Christian family, sometimes the converse is true. Sometimes we think that the time of Jesus was the golden time of faith. It was the best time to be alive, and that it's downhill from there. That the Christian family was at its height, and it's just a series of errors since then. So that's another way to think about God being present and then sort of going dormant. And often we think about our own history as a Christian family that way. All of these assumptions we bring to the table when we listen to these women's voices and what they have to say about God. Some of our assumptions are that history is irrelevant. Some of our assumptions are that our own Christian family surely can't be as stellar as the first Christians could be. But if we think of studying church history and hearing these voices as a family reunion, then we can reframe how to receive and how to listen. So think about what happens at a family reunion. Aunts and uncles, grandmothers and grandfathers, cousins, people come to the family reunion and gather to tell stories. Just as in our family of faith, when we gather, we hear in our family of faith the scripture stories, and we hear in our family of faith the history stories. When you think of the last family reunion you went to, you probably heard some of the same stories that you hear every time you gather. The same stories. Why those stories? Because those are the stories that tell who we are as a family. The same stories that are told over and over that form us in becoming a member of that family. We also hear the same fights often over and over. And Uncle Larry still won't sit down to eat at the same table with Uncle David. And it's been 15 years. And sometimes at family reunions, we hear secrets or a surprise unearthed. We might say, I was 40 years old before I found out my Aunt Edna had been married once before. Why didn't anybody tell me that? That there are things in the family that are stories not told very often or are too painful to tell. The son who died in the war, the niece who drowned. And those stories aren't told as frequently. They're just too hard to tell, and yet they're the stories that make up the family's culture and the family's identity. Growing up, I heard a story over and over again. My great-grandfather, Ira Clark, was a railroad man in Amarillo, Texas. He owned a piece of property in downtown Amarillo and sold it, a very valuable piece of property, because he had a dream that he wanted to spend the summer taking his 6 kids to Chicago to get music lessons. So he sold the property. He took his 6 kids, one of whom was my grandmother, Lily Oden. And they spent the summer riding the streetcar and making boiled egg sandwiches. And the 3 older kids took violin, harp, and piano lessons in the morning. And the afternoon, their job was to teach what they'd learned to the 3 younger kids. They couldn't afford for them all to take lessons. And my grandmother told this story with great pride and great joy. Now, this story could be the story of a man who was irresponsible, who wasted his resources. But in my family, this was a story about who we are. We're a family that is musical. We're a family that drinks deep from the well of life and that knows how to use resources for things that matter. That's what it is to be an Odin. I learned how to be an Odin by being at Odin family gatherings, by hearing this story of the Chicago summer of music lessons. You know this in your own family of origin, and in the family that you may marry into. By being in the family, you learn what they value, what they expect, what they identify as characteristics of what it means to be a Smith or a Sanchez or a Patel. You've heard and been formed by the family stories and the gatherings and the reunions you're in. The same is true for the Christian family. When we gather, all of the saints around us, those living and those dead, to hear their stories, we are formed and we learn what it is to become and bear the name Christian. But there's another compelling reason to listen to these voices, in addition to our own formation, and that is that God is revealed. God is revealed in the stories. Scripture is our primary source of revelation, but God doesn't stop there. God didn't speak in Scripture and then go on vacation. Our proclamation as Christians is that our God is a living God, not a dead God or a dormant God or an absentee God, but a God that is present, really present, living in and among us now, in every molecule, in every moment. And that's always been true. And if that's always been true and we want to know God, then we had better pay attention to how God has been present in the lives of the Christians that have gone before us. We're pretty good at getting that God is present across space, right? We don't believe God only exists in the sanctuary at the church or only in the pastor's study. We understand God exists across space. God also exists across time. So God is as present to the lives we're going to hear about as God is present to our own. There's an expansiveness to God's work, an expansiveness to God's presence everywhere we look in our Christian family reunion, an embarrassment of riches, just full. And so we'll see that in these lives, in the voices of women who speak about their view of God, their experiences, and their struggles. Now, these stories may be familiar to you, and many of these stories may be new to you. We haven't received women's stories in the family as carefully. We haven't archived them always as carefully as some other stories. But if we just scratch the surface, our family gatherings are chock full of women's voices and women's stories of God. We're formed by our stories, so we need all the voices at the table, and we'll celebrate these in all of their joys and their struggles. They reflect the fullness of God's revelation in our family. So let the stories begin. We'll listen to these stories, and just as importantly, we'll listen to yours.
As you were talking about stories, I thought of narrative theology. What role does myth play in that? Would you talk to us about myth in the stories?
All of our big narratives, all of our big stories that tell us who we are, creation, redemption, are full of myth, because myth is the language to express that relationship between the human and the divine. Myth is not a false language, it's a true language. It's different than discursive language, but it's a very particular way of expressing that divine-human relationship that we'll see throughout the Christian family and throughout the human family. It's just native to our way of telling stories.
Amy, could you talk a little bit more about saints? Because I didn't really grow up, and a lot of people in my church didn't grow up. I sort of think of that as sort of another traditions idea, but it seems to be very important to you in talking about this story.
In our Christian family, we all have had the experience of people who are very spiritually powerful in our lives. Those are the saints. It's only been very recently that as a Christian family we've sort of set up criteria for sainthood canonization. That's a relatively recent development in the last few hundred years. More importantly has been our recognition that we do not walk this path alone, that we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. And in that sense, many, many, many saints that are with us here now, you each brought dozens with you into this room that made you who you are and got you here today. And those are ways of seeing God revealed in time.